The cabin hummed with the low, steady drone of jet engines, the kind of sound that lulls most people into a quiet trance. Outside, the sky stretched endlessly, deep blue giving way to streaks of orange as the sun dipped toward the horizon. Inside first class, passengers settled into their wide, cushioned seats, some sipping sparkling water, others flipping through magazines or closing their eyes for a nap. It was the kind of calm that comes with altitude and privilege, but not everyone was calm. Near the front of the cabin, a man in a sharply tailored navy suit leaned toward his seatmate, voice just loud enough to carry. "Honestly," he said, swirling ice in his whiskey glass, "I don't know how they let just anyone in here these days. First class used to mean something." His companion, a quiet woman in a silk scarf, offered a polite smile but said nothing. She'd learned long ago that agreeing was easier than arguing. The man's eyes scanned the cabin, landing on a figure a few rows back. This man sat alone, dressed in a plain black jacket, faded jeans, and scuffed boots. No flashy watch, no designer luggage, just a worn paperback in his hands and a small duffel bag tucked under the seat. He hadn't asked for champagne or extra pillows. He hadn't even made eye contact with the flight attendants beyond a quiet thank you when they offered him a drink. "Look at that," the businessman said, nodding toward him with a smirk. "Dressed like he's still trying to get a gig at some dive bar. Probably thinks sitting up here makes him somebody." A few nearby passengers shifted in their seats. One woman pulled her headphones off slightly, frowning, but no one spoke up. Confrontation wasn't part of the first-class experience. Comfort and silence were. The man in the black jacket didn't react. He turned a page, his expression unreadable behind dark sunglasses. He'd boarded without fanfare, nodded politely to the crew, and settled in like any other traveler. If he heard the comment, he gave no sign, but the businessman wasn't done. "You know," he continued louder now, "some people really believe their own press. Walk around like they're legends when really they're just ghosts, forgotten, washed up." This time, a flight attendant paused mid-aisle. She was in her 50s with kind eyes and silver streaks in her hair. She'd been flying for over 2 decades and had seen celebrities, CEOs, and even royalty pass through these cabins. She knew better than to react, but her grip tightened slightly on her tray. The man in the black jacket finally looked up. Not with anger, not with offense, just a quiet glance, calm and steady. Then he went back to his book. That glance, though brief, seemed to fuel the businessman's need to prove a point. He leaned back, chuckling to himself. Classic. Thinks silence makes him mysterious. Newsflash, it just makes you irrelevant. His seatmate finally spoke, voice low. Maybe he just wants to be left alone. Everyone wants to be left alone, he shot back. But not everyone gets to sit in first class looking like they lost a bet. A ripple of discomfort moved through the cabin. A man across the aisle closed his laptop. A couple whispered to each other. Even the flight attendants exchanged a look, one that said, "Here we go again." But the truth was, no one wanted to get involved. Not on a long flight. Not when there was nothing to gain and everything to lose, peace, privacy, the illusion of harmony. Still, something about the quiet man's stillness felt off, not weak, not timid, just deeply unbothered, and that somehow made the businessman even more irritated. He flagged down a passing attendant. "Another whiskey. Neat. And tell whoever's in charge that if you're going to upgrade strays, at least make sure they know how to act." The attendant nodded politely, but her eyes flicked toward the man in the black jacket before she walked away. There was something in that glance, respect maybe, or recognition. Minutes passed. The plane leveled out at cruising altitude. Clouds drifted below like cotton fields. The businessman sipped his fresh drink, satisfied he'd made his point. He pulled out his phone, opened a social media app, and started typing. Flying first class with a guy who looks like he got lost on his way to a biker funeral. Some people really think showing up is enough. He paused, thumb hovering over post. Part of him wanted the likes, the laughs, the validation. But another part, the part that had noticed the flight crew's subtle reactions, hesitated. Just then, the man in the black jacket stood up. Not dramatically, not angrily. He simply closed his book, tucked it into his jacket pocket, and walked toward the restroom at the front of the cabin. As he passed the businessman's row, their eyes met again, briefly but long enough for the businessman to feel a strange flicker of doubt. There was no glare, no challenge, just a quiet presence that seemed to fill the space without trying. The man kept walking, The businessman stared after him, then down at his phone. He deleted the draft. When the man returned to his seat, he didn't look around. He didn't sigh or shake his head. He just sat down, adjusted his sunglasses, and opened his book again, as if nothing had happened. But something had. The cabin felt different. Not because of shouting or drama, but because of what hadn't happened. No retaliation, no ego. Just silence thick with unspoken dignity. The businessman finished his drink in silence. He didn't speak again for the rest of the flight. He watched the clouds, replaying his own words in his head, hearing them now not as clever jabs but as hollow noise. Outside, the sky darkened. Stars began to appear, tiny, distant, indifferent to the small dramas unfolding miles below. And somewhere in that quiet cabin, a man who thought he was important began to wonder if he'd just mistaken volume for value. The flight attendants moved softly down the aisle, dimming the lights, offering blankets. The man in the black jacket accepted one with a nod and a soft, "Thank you." Then he leaned his head back, closed his eyes, and let the hum of the engines carry him forward, unseen, unbothered and utterly himself. No one knew it yet. But this flight wouldn't be remembered for its destination. It would be remembered for the moment arrogance met humility, and didn't even realize it had lost. The businessman sat stiffly in his seat, the ice in his empty glass long melted. He told himself it was just nerves, the kind that come from too much caffeine and too little sleep. But deep down, he knew it was something else. That quiet glance from the man in the black jacket had stuck with him like a burr in his shoe. He couldn't shake it. A few minutes later, a flight attendant approached. She wasn't the one who'd served him earlier. This one moved with a calm certainty, her uniform crisp, her expression unreadable. She leaned down slightly, voice low but clear. "Sir, would you mind stepping into the galley for a moment? There's something I'd like to share with you, privately." He frowned. "Is there a problem?" "No problem at all," she said gently. "Just a quick word." Curious and a little annoyed, he unbuckled his seatbelt and followed her past the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the plane. The galley was tight, warm, humming with the soft clink of glasses and the whisper of airflow. She closed the curtain behind them. "Look," he started, crossing his arms, "if this is about that comment I made—" "It's not about that," she interrupted, her tone firm but kind. "It's about who you were talking about." He blinked. "What do you mean?" She took a breath. "The gentleman you were referring to, he's Keanu Reeves." For a second, he just stared at her. Then he laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Right, and I'm Tom Cruise." "Come on," but she didn't smile. She just looked at him, steady and serious. "I've been flying this route for 12 years. I've seen him board this exact flight 3 times before. Always alone. Always in coach, or if upgraded, never asking for it. Always polite. Always remembers our names." He stopped laughing. "He asked us not to say anything," she continued. "Said he just wanted a quiet flight. No photos, no fuss. He even tipped the ground crew before boarding, handed each of them a 20 and thanked them for their work." The businessman's stomach dropped. He thought of his loud remarks, his smirking tone, the draft he'd almost posted. His face grew warm, but he doesn't look like... He trailed off, realizing how stupid that sounded. "He doesn't need to," she said simply. "He's never acted like he's better than anyone. In fact, he's the opposite. Last year, one of our attendants was going through chemo. He found out somehow just from small talk and sent her flowers after the flight. No note, no return address. Just kindness," the businessman swallowed. "I didn't know." "No one expects you to," she said. "But now you do." She stepped aside, giving him space to return to his seat. He walked back slowly, his polished shoes suddenly feeling heavy. He kept his eyes down, but he could feel the weight of the cabin, the quiet judgment, or maybe just his own shame, back in his seat. He stole another glance at Keanu. He was speaking softly to an elderly woman a few rows over. She'd dropped her book, and he'd picked it up for her, handing it back with both hands like it mattered. She smiled, touched his arm briefly, and said something that made him nod with genuine warmth. No performance. No camera, just 2 people being human. The businessman looked away, his throat tight. He remembered how he'd treated the valet that morning, snapped at him for taking too long with the car. How he'd ignored the barista who'd gotten his order wrong, even though she'd apologized 3 times. How he'd bragged in the lounge about earning his seat while others just got lucky. Now he wondered, what if luck wasn't the point? What if it was about how you carried yourself, especially when no one was watching? As the flight leveled out over the Rockies, the sun now fully set, the cabin lights dimmed further. Most passengers dozed, but the businessman stayed wide awake, replaying every word he'd said. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw something else. A young flight attendant, maybe early 20s. Nervous energy in her movements, was struggling with a tray of drinks. She'd just started, he guessed. Her hands shook slightly as she tried to balance 3 glasses. As she passed Keanu's row, her foot caught on the carpet edge. The tray tipped, water and juice splashed across the aisle, soaking the carpet near the businessman's seat. The young woman froze, eyes wide with panic. "Oh no, I'm so sorry. I'll clean it right away." Before she could drop to her knees, Keanu stood up. "Hey," he said, calm as morning light. "It's okay." He grabbed a handful of napkins from his seat pocket and knelt beside her. Not dramatically, not for show, just helped. He dabbed at the spill, handed her more napkins, and said, "Happens to everyone." "You're doing great." The young woman blinked back tears. "Thank you," she whispered. He gave her a small smile, warm, real, and went back to his seat. The businessman watched, stunned. He'd expected anger or at least annoyance, not this, not grace. Later during dinner service, Keanu declined the champagne, asked for still water instead. When the same young attendant brought it, he looked her in the eye and said, "Thanks, Lena." She lit up, clearly surprised he remembered her name from the boarding announcement hours ago. The businessman ordered another whiskey, but when it came, he barely touched it. It tasted like regret. He overheard a couple whispering nearby. "Did you know he once paid for a stranger's cancer treatment?" the woman said. "Just saw them crying in a diner, asked what was wrong, and wrote a check on the spot." "Sounds like a myth," her partner said. "Not a myth," the woman replied. "My cousin works at the hospital." "It's true." The businessman stared out the window. City lights began to flicker in the distance. New York, rising like a constellation from the earth. He thought about all the times he'd used his success as a weapon, all the times he'd measured his worth by what he owned, where he sat, who he knew. And here was a man with more fame, more money, more reason to demand attention, choosing to disappear into kindness instead. As the plane began its descent, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "We're starting our approach into JFK. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened." The businessman clicked his belt with numb fingers. He wanted to say something, to apologize, to explain, to undo the arrogance that now felt so ugly in his chest. But what could he possibly say that wouldn't sound like damage control? He watched Keanu help the elderly woman gather her things, gently lifting her small suitcase from the overhead bin. She patted his arm again, eyes shining. He walked her to the jet bridge, staying close in case she needed support. By the time the businessman stood to collect his own bag, Keanu was gone. Vanished through a side door with a quiet nod to the crew. No fanfare, no entourage, just a man heading home. A ground agent passed by, saw the businessman's dazed expression, and said softly, "He does that. Always takes the service exit. Doesn't want to cause a scene." The businessman nodded, unable to speak. Back in the terminal, he passed a newsstand. A magazine cover caught his eye. Keanu Reeves smiling, that quiet half-smile, headline reading, "The Most Humble Man in Hollywood." He didn't buy it, but he remembered it. In the back of his waiting car, the driver asked, "Good flight, sir?" He looked out at the city lights, the endless rush of people going places, doing things, being someone. "Not as good as it could have been," he said quietly. And for the first time in years, he meant it. The weeks after the flight passed in a blur of meetings, calls, and the usual rhythm of a life built on deadlines and deals. But something had shifted. The businessman still wore his expensive suits, still sat at the head of the table, still signed checks that made others pause in awe. Yet inside there was a quiet hum, a new awareness that followed him like a shadow. He couldn't stop thinking about that moment in the sky. The spilled drinks, the young attendant's panic, and the way Keanu had knelt without hesitation, not as a star, but as a person. No performance, no expectation of thanks, just help, offered freely. It replayed in his mind during board meetings, during late-night drives, even while brushing his teeth. Not as a memory, but as a question. Why didn't I do that? He'd spent years believing kindness was weakness, something for people who couldn't compete. Success in his world meant sharp elbows and sharper words. You didn't hold doors, you walked through them first. You didn't say, please, to service staff. You expected perfection without asking. But now, that philosophy felt hollow, like a suit with no body inside. One rainy Tuesday, he found himself in a high-rise office overlooking the city. His assistant, a woman in her 30s who'd been with him for years, brought in his morning coffee. She set it down carefully on the glass desk, but her hands were full, and a single drop splashed onto a folder of contracts. She froze. "I'm so sorry." Oldham would have sighed, maybe snapped. "Watch what you're doing." He'd done it 100 times before. It was just part of the dance, her mistake, his correction. But this time he paused. He looked at her, not at the spill, but at her. Saw the dark circles under her eyes, the way she held her shoulders tight like she was bracing for impact. He remembered how she'd stayed late last week to fix a presentation glitch, how she never complained, even when he changed plans last minute. "It's fine," he said, voice softer than he intended. "Thanks for getting it to me so fast." Her eyes widened slightly. She nodded, almost confused, then left without another word. He stared at the coffee stain. It wasn't perfect, but neither was he. That small moment stuck with him all day, not because it was grand, but because it was real, and it made him wonder how many other tiny chances he'd missed, how many people he'd made feel small just to feel big himself. Later that week, he took another flight, this time alone, no seatmate to impress. Mate 2. As he settled into first class, he noticed a flight attendant struggling with a passenger's oversized bag. The passenger was impatient, arms crossed, muttering about incompetence. The attendant, a man in his 50s with tired eyes, tried to lift it, his back clearly bothering him. Without thinking, the businessman stood. "Let me help," the passenger scoffed. Finally, someone with sense. But the businessman ignored him. He took the bag, hoisted it into the bin with a grunt, and turned to the attendant. "You okay?" The man nodded, surprised. "Yeah, just an old injury. Thanks." "No problem." He sat back down, heart pounding, not from exertion but from something else. It felt good. Not in a boastful way, but in a quiet, human way. Like he'd reconnected with a part of himself he'd forgotten existed. That night at home, he scrolled through news on his tablet. A headline caught his eye. "Actor funds new wing at Children's Hospital. No press, no ceremony." The article described how a quiet donation, enough to build an entire treatment unit, had arrived with no fanfare, only a note that read, "For the kids who fight harder than anyone." He didn't need to see the name. He knew. He thought about all the times he'd donated to charity, for the tax break, for the plaque on the wall, for the photo op. Never just because it was right. Never without expecting something back. Now, the idea of giving without recognition felt foreign and strangely freeing. The next morning, he called his financial advisor. "Set up an anonymous donation," he said, "to that children's hospital. Same amount as last year's gala contribution. But don't put my name on it. Don't tell anyone." There was a pause. "Are you sure? The board was expecting your name on the donor wall." "Let someone else have the wall," he said. "Just do it." A few days later, he found himself in a coffee shop near his office. He ordered his usual, black, no sugar, and waited at the pickup counter. The barista, a young woman with bright blue hair and tired eyes, called his name. As she handed him the cup, her hand slipped. Hot coffee splashed onto the counter, some of it hitting his sleeve. She gasped. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I'll remake it right now." He looked at her. Really looked. Saw the name tag. Jasmine. Saw the smudged eyeliner, the way she kept glancing at the clock like she was counting minutes until her shift ended. "It's okay," he said. "Happens to everyone." She blinked. You're not mad? Why would I be? He pulled a napkin from the dispenser and wiped his sleeve. You're doing your best. That's enough. She stared at him like he'd spoken in another language. Then slowly she smiled. A real one, not the forced kind service workers often wear. Thank you, she said, voice thick. He nodded, took his coffee and walked out. The coffee was lukewarm, slightly bitter, but it tasted better than any he'd had in years. Back in his car, he thought about Keanu again. Not as a celebrity, but as a mirror. A man who chose kindness, not because it was easy, but because it mattered. Who treated everyone like they belonged, even when the world told him he was above them. That evening, he went for a walk instead of heading straight home. Past a bus stop where a woman was trying to calm a crying toddler while balancing grocery bags. Without thinking, he stopped. Need a hand? She looked up, wary at first. But something in his tone, maybe the lack of expectation, made her nod. He carried her bags to her apartment building 2 blocks away. She thanked him at the door, eyes tired but grateful. No problem, he said. Take care of that little one. As he walked back, the city lights flickered around him. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was above the crowd. He felt like he was part of it, and that, he realized, was worth more than any first-class seat. Later that night, lying in bed, he thought about the flight again. Not with shame anymore, but with clarity. That moment hadn't been about Keanu Reeves, the actor. It had been about Keanu Reeves, the human, and the quiet challenge he'd unknowingly issued. What kind of person will you be when no one's watching? The businessman didn't have all the answers. But for the first time, he was asking the right questions. And sometimes that's where change begins. Not with a grand gesture, but with a spilled drink, a held door, a simple thank you that means more than it says. In the quiet dark, he smiled. Not because he'd become someone new, but because he was finally becoming someone real. The apology sat in his chest like a stone, unspoken, heavy, and growing heavier by the day. Weeks had passed since the flight, and though he'd started making small changes in how he treated people, that one moment still haunted him. Not because he'd been rude to a famous actor, but because he'd been cruel to a stranger who'd done nothing but exist quietly in the world. He'd rehearsed the words 100 times. I was out of line. I judged you without knowing you. I'm sorry. Simple. Honest. But every time he imagined saying them, his pride flared up like an old reflex. What if Keanu didn't care? What if he laughed? What if he said, why now? And he had no good answer? Still, the need to make things right wouldn't leave him alone. Then, by chance, he saw an article online. Keanu would be in the city for a private event, a charity dinner for a youth arts program. No red carpet, no press, just a quiet gathering at a downtown hotel. The businessman didn't know how he got the details, but he did. And something in him stirred. He wasn't invited. He knew that. But maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to say what he needed to say, without making it about himself. He dressed simply that evening, dark slacks, a plain button-down, no tie. Left his watch at home, took a cab instead of his usual town car. When he arrived at the hotel, he lingered near the side entrance, watching guests trickle in. Most were local teachers, community leaders, a few artists. No paparazzi, no fuss. Then he saw him. Keanu stepped out of a modest sedan wearing the same kind of clothes he'd worn on the plane. Black jacket, jeans, boots. He greeted the doorman by name, shook hands with a volunteer holding a clipboard, and walked inside like he belonged there, not because of fame, but because he chose to show up. The businessman's pulse quickened. This was his chance. He waited until the flow of guests slowed, then approached the volunteer. I'm not on the list, he said quietly, but I just need 2 minutes to say something important to someone inside. The volunteer, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes, studied him. You're not press, are you? No, never. She hesitated, then sighed. He doesn't like surprises, but if you're quick and quiet, I'll let you wait by the coat check. Don't cause a scene. He nodded, heart pounding. Inside, the room was warm, filled with soft chatter and the smell of roasted vegetables and fresh bread. No glitter, no champagne towers, Just long tables, string lights, and people laughing like old friends. At the center table, Keanu sat listening intently to a teenage girl describing her mural project. He wasn't performing. He was present. The businessman stood near the back, hands in his pockets, watching. He saw Keanu lean forward, ask thoughtful questions, laugh at something genuine. Saw how the girl's shoulders relaxed, how her voice grew stronger as she spoke. This wasn't a photo op. It was real life. He took a step forward, then stopped. Because in that moment he realized something. If he walked over now, it wouldn't be about making things right. It would be about easing his own guilt. And that wasn't fair. To Keanu, to the people here, or even to himself. True apology wasn't about being seen. It was about change. So he turned around. He walked out the same side door he'd come in. The cool night air hitting his face like a reset. He didn't look back. But he didn't feel defeated either. He felt clear. The next morning he called his office. "Cancel my lunch meeting," he said. "I'm going to visit the community center downtown, the one that runs the after-school art program." His assistant was confused. "The one that's underfunded? You've never shown interest before." "I'm showing interest now." He spent the afternoon there not as a donor, but as a listener. He sat with kids painting murals, teens building robots, elders teaching chess. He asked questions. He carried supplies. He washed brushes in a sink full of soapy water, sleeves rolled up, no one knowing who he was. And for the first time in years, he felt useful. Not because of his title, but because he showed up. Later that week, he arranged a quiet, anonymous donation to the center, enough to cover rent for a year and buy new art supplies. No plaque, no announcement, just support given freely. He also wrote a letter. Not to Keanu because he knew it would never be read, but to himself. In it, he admitted how much he'd confused success with superiority, how he'd used his position to make others feel small so he could feel tall, and how one quiet man on a plane had shown him that real strength lies in gentleness. He tucked the letter into his desk drawer. Not to forget it, but to remember. A few days later, he boarded another flight, this time to Chicago. As he settled into his seat, he noticed a nurse in economy visible through the open curtain. She looked exhausted. Dark circles under her eyes, uniform wrinkled. She rubbed her temples and closed her eyes, clearly trying to rest before a long shift. The flight attendant came by. "Sir, would you like your seat reclined?" He glanced at the nurse, then at his own spacious seat. Plenty of legroom, a lie-flat bed, a pillow wrapped in crisp linen. "No," he said. "Actually, is it possible to switch seats? I'd like to give mine to someone who needs it more." The attendant blinked. "You're sure?" "Positive." She checked with the crew, then nodded. A few minutes later, the nurse was gently guided into first class, bewildered but grateful. I don't understand," she said. "You've earned it," he replied simply. "Go rest." As he walked back to economy, passengers glanced at him, some curious, some skeptical. He didn't care. He found his new seat, small and stiff, and buckled in. It wasn't comfortable, but it felt right. During the flight, he overheard the nurse whispering to a fellow passenger. "Some stranger just gave me his first-class seat. Didn't even tell me his name." He smiled to himself, looking out the window at the clouds below. He never got to say, "I'm sorry," to Keanu Reeves. But maybe he didn't need to. Because the real apology wasn't in words, it was in action. In choosing every day to be a little kinder, a little quieter, a little more human, and sometimes that's enough. The plane hummed on, carrying him forward, not toward redemption, but toward something quieter, deeper, the slow, steady work of becoming someone he could finally respect. No cameras. No applause. Just a man, a choice, and the sky stretching endlessly ahead. Time has a way of smoothing sharp edges. What once felt like a crisis, the shame, the regret, the need to fix something that couldn't be undone, slowly settled into something quieter, a new rhythm of living. The businessman still worked long hours. He still made tough calls and signed big deals. But the way he moved through the world had changed, not in grand gestures, but in the small spaces between words and actions. He no longer measured his day by wins or losses, but by moments, tiny, ordinary moments that used to slip past unnoticed. Like holding the elevator for someone rushing with coffee, or remembering the name of the security guard who greeted him each morning, or simply saying thank you like he meant it. One rainy afternoon, he sat in his office watching people scurry under umbrellas on the street below. His assistant knocked softly and entered with a folder. She set it down gently, careful not to disturb the papers already on his desk. "Thanks," he said, looking up. She paused. "You've been different lately." He smiled faintly. "Is that a bad thing?" "No," she said, almost surprised. "It's just—" Nice, that word. Nice used to feel small to him. In his old world, it was what you called someone who wasn't sharp enough, bold enough, ruthless enough. But now he saw it for what it really was, a quiet kind of courage. The courage to be kind when no one's watching, to choose patience over pride, to see people, not just roles. A few days later, he received an email from the Community Arts Center. Attached was a photo, a mural painted by teenagers, bright and full of life. In the corner, almost hidden among the swirls of color, was a small symbol, a coffee cup with steam rising like a question mark. The note read, "For the stranger who gave us space to create. We don't know your name, but we see you." He stared at the image for a long time. Then he printed it and taped it to the inside of his office cabinet, somewhere only he would see it. A reminder that impact doesn't need a spotlight. He also started volunteering, not for visibility, but for connection. Every other Saturday, he helped serve meals at a local shelter. At first, he kept to himself, stacking plates and pouring coffee. But over time, he began to listen. He heard stories of loss, resilience, hope. He met a veteran who used to be an engineer, a single mother studying for her nursing license, a teenager who wrote poetry in a tattered notebook. No one knew who he was. And for the first time, he liked it that way. One evening, as he was wiping down tables after dinner service, an older man approached him. "You're here every other week," he said. "Never talk much. But you show up." "I try," the businessman replied. The man nodded. "That's rarer than you think." Those words stayed with him. Back in his daily life, he began to notice how often people performed kindness without expecting anything back. The barista who remembered a regular's order after one visit. The delivery driver who waited in the rain to make sure a package didn't get wet. The neighbor who shoveled snow from the sidewalk without being asked. He realized Keanu hadn't been special because he was famous. He'd been special because he chose every day to treat the world gently, even when he didn't have to, and that choice was available to anyone. One morning, while reading the news over coffee, he came across a short article. A children's hospital had opened a new wing dedicated to holistic care, music therapy, art rooms, quiet spaces for families. The funding had come from an anonymous donor. The only clue? A quote etched into the welcome wall. "Be kind." The rest is noise. He knew without being told who it was from, but more importantly, he understood what it meant. Kindness wasn't about scale. It wasn't about headlines or hashtags. It was about showing up fully, quietly, consistently for the people right in front of you. Months passed. Seasons turned. The businessman stopped thinking of himself as someone who needed to fix his past. Instead, he focused on building a present worth being proud of. Then came another flight. This time, he wasn't in first class. He'd booked economy on purpose, a red-eye to San Francisco. The cabin was full, the air thick with the hum of tired travelers. As he settled into his narrow seat, he noticed a young woman across the aisle. She looked exhausted, eyes red-rimmed, clutching a tissue. Next to her sat a small suitcase covered in hospital stickers. He didn't ask questions, but during the drink service, he caught the flight attendant's eye and quietly paid for the woman's meal upgrade, her headphones, and a blanket. "Don't tell her it's from me," he whispered. Later, when turbulence jolted the plane and the woman flinched, he offered her his extra pillow. "Long shift?" he asked gently. She nodded. "Just finished a week at the pediatric ward. My mom's sick. Flying home to see her." He didn't offer advice, didn't say everything will be okay. He just said, "You're doing something important." She looked at him, really looked, and for the first time that night, her shoulders relaxed. When the plane landed, he let her deplane first. He watched her walk away, a little straighter, a little lighter. And he felt something settle inside him, not pride, but peace. On the ride to his hotel, he scrolled through his phone and saw a friend had shared a short video. It wasn't viral, just a clip from an airport somewhere. In it, Keanu sat on a bench talking with a janitor. They were laughing about something, shoulders shaking, two men sharing a moment like old friends. No cameras, no script. Just humanity. The caption read, "Fame fades. Kindness doesn't." He closed the video and looked out the window. The city lights blurred past, thousands of lives intersecting, colliding, supporting each other in ways no one would ever film or post. He thought about the flight that started it all. Not as a mistake, but as a mirror. It hadn't been about Keanu Reeves. It had been about him. About who he was, who he wanted to be, and the quiet space in between where change happens. Back at his hotel, he unpacked slowly. In his suitcase, tucked between shirts, was a small notebook. On the first page, he'd written weeks ago, "What if I tried to be the kind of person who makes others feel seen?" Now on the last page, he wrote, "Turns out I already am." He didn't need applause. He didn't need forgiveness from a stranger on a plane. He just needed to keep showing up, with humility, with attention, with care. Because sometimes the most powerful lessons aren't shouted. They're whispered in the space between kindness and silence, and only those willing to listen truly hear them. And in that listening, a life can change. Not all at once, but one quiet choice at a time.